Welcome to the deep dive. You're here because you want to understand the important stuff quickly, without getting too bogged down. Today we're doing just that with a critical look at the unintended acceleration events involving Toyota vehicles. These really started cropping up around the 2002 model year.
That's right. And you've brought some really significant material, especially concerning that tragic accident in San Diego, August 2009. That involved an off-duty highway patrol officer, Mark Saylor, and his family. Their Lexus ES350. It hit speeds over 100 miles per hour.
Despite heavy braking, right? I remember reading about damage to the brake rotors, indicating they were really standing on the brakes. Tragically, all 4 people in the car were killed.
Exactly. And, initially the focus or the blame seemed to land squarely on floor mats. There were recalls for that.
But that awful event, it really kicked off much deeper investigations, didn't it? Looking into potential issues going back years, even to 2002.
It did. So our mission today in this deep dive is really to pull out the key learnings from everything that followed the investigations, the lawsuits, the technical analyses. We want to give listeners a clearer picture of what likely went wrong and, maybe more importantly, the broader implications for automotive safety, especially with cars becoming so software dependent.
Okay. And we've got a good range of sources to draw on: reports from NASA, NHTSA, court documents from a key trial called the Bookout Trial, expert analyses. We're planning to focus quite a bit on the technical aspects, what the code and the systems revealed about software safety.
Makes sense. So maybe let's start with the timeline. How did this unfold publicly with the recalls and investigations?
Good idea. Well, even before the Saylor accident, there was actually a recall way back in September 2007, just about fastening floor mats properly.
Right, a relatively minor thing, it seemed at the time. But then after the Saylor crash in late '09, that triggered much wider floor mat recalls in October and November.
And then things escalated. From January 2010 onwards, we started seeing recalls for potentially sticky gas pedals.
Yeah.
So the narrative was already shifting beyond just floor mats.
It definitely signaled a growing concern, like maybe there were more systemic issues at play.
And it went right to the top, didn't it?
Yeah.
Toyota's president actually testified before the U.S. Congress in February 2010.
Yes, a huge moment.
Yeah.
And the financial side started rolling soon after, with the venue for the economic loss class action suit being chosen in April 2010.
Now, running alongside all this public activity was a pretty significant technical investigation by NASA, right? From 2010 into 2011.
That's a crucial piece. NASA was specifically tasked with looking into the Electronic Throttle Control System, the ETCS. The ETCS is basically the system that manages engine power. It controls the air, the fuel, the spark. It translates your foot on the pedal into acceleration.
Which makes it inherently safety critical. If that system tells the engine to go full throttle when you don't want it to.
Precisely. And there was this very real concern about braking effectiveness in that scenario. If you're pumping the brakes, which people might instinctively do in a panic, you can lose the vacuum power assist.
Right.
And trying to hold the brake against a wide open throttle without that assist, it could take, on average, something like 175 pounds of force on the pedal.
Wow. Compared to what normally?
Normally, with vacuum assist, maybe 15 to, say, 44 pounds. A huge difference.
So the fear was a software glitch commanding full throttle could literally overpower the brakes, or at least the driver's ability to apply enough force.
Exactly. And I think Consumer Reports even did a video demonstrating this, showing a car still accelerating even with the brakes pushed hard.
I remember that. It really brought the potential danger home.
It did. And NASA also pointed out something important about driver behavior in these situations. When something sudden and terrifying like unintended acceleration happens, people don't always react logically. Shifting to neutral, turning off the ignition while moving, those aren't necessarily instinctive actions under extreme stress.
Makes sense. So NASA digs into the ETCS. What did they actually find? The headline finding was often reported as no smoking gun, right? No single electronic cause.
That was the common takeaway, yes. But, and this is a big but, their investigation had limitations. They were on a tight schedule. And crucially, it seems they didn't have all the information.
How so?
Well, their analysis focused mostly on the software running on the main CPU of the electronic throttle system. They didn't really analyze the software on the separate monitor chip, the ESPB2 chip, which was supposed to be part of the safety checking, the redundancy.
Okay. That does seem like a potential blind spot if you're looking at a system designed with a main processor and a monitor.
It does. And there were also questions later during legal proceedings about information Toyota provided to NASA regarding things like error-correcting memory, specifically whether it was present in certain model years. NASA seemed to accept Toyota's initial statements, but court testimony later suggested those statements might not have been accurate.
Okay, so NASA's report wasn't necessarily the final, definitive word on the electronics. What about the legal side? The financial fallout was pretty huge.
Massive. That economic loss class action settled in December 2012 for $1.6 billion. It covered models from 2002 up to 2010. Toyota didn't admit wrongdoing, technically, but as part of that settlement, they did agree to roll out a brake override firmware update in some of their newer vehicles.
Right, the brake override. If the brake and accelerator are pressed simultaneously, the brake wins.
Essentially, yes. But that settlement dealt with the economic losses, people claiming their cars lost value. What about accidents involving injuries or deaths?
That brings us to the Bookout trial, doesn't it? Bookout versus Schwartz in Oklahoma, October 2013.
Exactly. This is a really significant case. It involved a fatal crash back in 2007 with a 2005 Toyota Camry. And importantly, this specific car, this model year, wasn't covered by either the floor mat recalls or the sticky pedal recalls.
So the plaintiffs couldn't blame it on those known issues. What was the argument then?
Toyota's defense was driver error, arguing the driver, Ms. Bookout, mistakenly hit the gas pedal instead of the brake. Pedal misapplication.
A common defense in these types of cases.
Very. But the plaintiffs, represented by the Schwartz family for the passenger who also died, argued that the root cause was actually defects within the electronic throttle control system itself.
And they brought in technical experts to back this up.
Yes. Experts like Dr. Philip Koopman and Mr. Michael Barr gave testimony. They pointed to what they argued were serious flaws in the ETCS's safety architecture and the quality of its software. Plus, there was physical evidence, 150 feet of skid marks at the crash scene, suggesting the throttle was indeed open while the driver was braking hard.
So what did the jury decide?
The jury sided with the plaintiffs. They awarded $3 million in compensation, finding specifically that design defects in the ETCS were a cause of the fatal crash.
Wow. So a jury explicitly found the electronics at fault in this specific case.
They did. Toyota still disputes that verdict, it's worth noting. And after that verdict, a lot of the other similar federal cases were put on hold, eventually leading to mass settlements.
And separate from the civil suits, there was the U.S. government investigation, the criminal one.
Yes, that culminated in March 2014. Toyota agreed to pay a $1.2 billion fine to resolve the criminal investigation. The Department of Justice essentially said Toyota had concealed safety defects related to floor mats and sticky pedals from regulators and the public for years and made deceptive statements.
So not directly about the electronics in that fine, but about misleading statements regarding known mechanical issues.
Correct. It resulted in a deferred prosecution agreement, meaning the criminal charges will be dropped after 3 years if Toyota complied with certain conditions, including independent monitoring of its safety processes.
Okay, so you have NASA saying no single electronic smoking gun, but you have a jury finding ETCS defects caused a fatal crash and a massive government fine for misleading conduct.
It's complex. Yeah. It is, and it really forces us to look hard at the software safety practices involved. Because when you design these critical systems, there are, or should be, rigorous processes, right?
Yeah, talk about that. What are the established standards or approaches for safety-critical software?
Well, there's a core concept called safety integrity levels, or SILs. Basically, you assess how critical a system is, what's the worst that can happen if it fails. And that determines the level of rigor needed in development and testing. Higher potential severity means you need a higher SIL, demanding much stricter processes.
And there are standards that define these processes.
Yes. Various industries have them. For automotive, there was MISRA, Motor Industry Software Reliability Association guidelines, and later the more comprehensive ISO 26262 standard emerged. Aerospace has DO 178B, medical has FDA guidelines, industrial control has IEC 61508.
And what does following a SIL approach actually involve? Is it just about coding rules?
It's much broader. Yes, coding rules are part of it, aiming for near-perfect software quality. But it also involves designing out single points of failure, doing rigorous analysis of real-time scheduling to ensure tasks run reliably, having effective watchdog timers to catch failures, a solid software architecture, and maybe just as important, fostering a strong safety culture within the engineering teams. It's a whole life cycle process.
So in the U.S., are car manufacturers legally required to follow these specific standards like ISO 26262? Do they need certification?
Actually, no. There aren't mandatory federal requirements in the U.S. for automakers to follow specific software safety standards like ISO 26262 or get certified. The main regulations, the Federal Motor Vehicle Safety Standards, FMVSS, they tend to focus more on traditional hardware and crashworthiness. They don't really dive deep into software development processes.
But manufacturers can still be held liable if something goes wrong, right?
Absolutely. Even without specific software mandates, they have a legal duty of care. If their product is found to be unreasonably dangerous, perhaps due to a software flaw, they can absolutely be held liable in court.
Okay. So given these established, albeit not mandated, best practices, how did Toyota software development look when examined during the Bookout trial and by NASA?
Well, the picture that emerged was concerning from a best practices standpoint. For instance, Toyota didn't claim to have followed the MISRA guidelines, which were already well established for safety critical systems, even back when these cars were being designed in the late 90s and early 2000s.
Really? Not even claiming compliance?
Apparently not. And NASA, in their report, noted they didn't find evidence of things like a formal auditable software process plan or a written safety case document from Toyota, things you'd expect for a high-integrity system.
What was Toyota's counter-argument on the safety of their system?
Their expert witnesses argued strongly that no realistic fault within the ETCS could actually cause the kind of high-speed, sustained, unintended acceleration reported in cases like Bookout. They contended that the built-in fail-safe mechanisms would always detect such a fault and put the car into a safe, limp-home mode.
Okay, the fail-safes. But were those fail-safes foolproof?
That became a key point of contention. Let's take one example, the brake echo check. This was a failsafe designed to detect if the brake signal seemed inconsistent. But testimony revealed it required a complete release of the brake pedal. The brake lights had to actually go off for the check to reset and potentially activate.
So if someone was panicked and pumping the brakes, or just holding it down hard?
That specific failsafe might never engage, even if there was an underlying electronic issue causing acceleration. That's a significant limitation for a safety mechanism meant to protect against this exact scenario.
Yeah, that sounds like a critical weakness.
Yeah.
Now, earlier you touched on potential hardware faults. How realistic is that concern in these systems?
It's a very real factor in any complex electronic system, especially drive-by-wire ones. You can get what are called soft errors, basically, a stray radiation particle, flipping a bit in memory, or processor register. It sounds exotic, but it happens.
A bit flip, just randomly.
Yeah, cosmic rays, background radiation. It's a known phenomenon. Software bugs can also corrupt memory, achieving a similar effect. While the chance of it happening to one specific chip at any given moment is low, you have to consider the scale.
Millions of cars running these systems constantly.
Exactly. Across a huge fleet of vehicles operating for billions of hours, these random hardware faults aren't just possible, they are statistically expected to occur. You have to design for them.
How do you design them?
One key concept is fault containment regions, or FCRs. Think of them like firewalls or watertight compartments on a ship. You try to isolate different parts of the system so a fault in one area doesn't spread and take everything down. But a single FCR can't guarantee its own safety against every internal fault. For really critical functions, you need redundancy. Multiple independent FCRs that cross-check each other.
Like the main CPU and the monitor CPU in the Toyota system?
That was the idea. But the way it was implemented raised serious concerns. Evidence showed that critical input signals, like the readings from the accelerator pedal sensor and the throttle position sensor, were fed into both the main CPU and the monitor CPU through the same shared input circuitry on the same physical chip.
Wait, so they weren't truly independent inputs?
No. It created a potential single point of failure. A hardware fault in that shared input block could, theoretically, send bad data to both the main processor and its supposed safety monitor simultaneously.
Which completely undermines the point of having a monitor chip checking the main one, if they're both getting the same wrong information.
Precisely. It defeats the purpose of that redundancy layer, at least for faults occurring in that shared input path.
Okay, that's a major architectural concern. What about the software code itself? You mentioned MISRA earlier. What did the investigations find regarding actual coding practices?
This is where things looked particularly problematic based on the evidence presented, especially in the Bookout trial. Toyota had claimed something like 50% overlap with MISRA coding rules.
Which sounds, okay, maybe, halfway there.
Well, digging deeper, it turned out they were only comparing against a very small subset of the MISRA rules. Only 11 specific rules were found in Toyota's internal standards, and even against their own internal standards, there were widespread violations.
Oh, widespread.
NASA's automated tools found over 7,000 violations of easily checkable MISRA and SIL rules in the code they examined. Michael Barr's team, doing a deeper dive for the Bookout trial, reported finding around 80,000 violations in the engine control software.
80,000.
Yeah.
That's staggering.
It suggests a lack of rigorous adherence to coding discipline you'd expect in safety-critical software. It wasn't just MISRA rules either. Static analysis tool software that scans code for potential bugs without running it flagged numerous other issues.
Like what?
Things like variables declared but never used, potential recursion issues, which we can talk more about, global variables declared with different types in different places, risky data conversions, confusing code where conditions had side effects, variables used before they were initialized, array setup errors, lots of red flags for potential bugs.
Wasn't there a concern about code complexity, making it hard to test?
Yes, absolutely. There's a metric called McCabe cyclomatic complexity. Think of it as measuring how many twists and turns, how many different paths there are through a piece of code. High complexity means it's like tangled spaghetti, very hard to understand, very hard to test thoroughly, and easy for bugs to hide in.
Spaghetti code.
Right. Some functions in the Toyota ETCS code had extremely high complexity scores. Scores over 50 are often considered untestable or unmaintainable. One critical function, the one calculating the throttle angle, reportedly had a complexity of 146. It was over 1,300 lines long, and crucially, the expert testimony indicated there was no evidence of a corresponding unit test plan to verify it worked correctly under all conditions.
Wow. 146 complexity, 1,300 lines, no test plan. That sounds like a recipe for trouble.
It's certainly far from ideal practice for safety-critical code. Another major issue flagged was the heavy use of global variables.
How does that impact safety?
Ideally, in high-integrity systems, you want very few, ideally zero, variables that can be read and written from anywhere in the code. These are global variables. They make it incredibly hard to reason about the software's state because any part of the code could potentially change them unexpectedly.
Yeah.
Toyota's code reportedly had thousands of these read-write global variables, over 11,000, according to Barr's analysis. Critical data, like the target throttle angle and the reported engine speed, were globals. NASA's analysis found something like 82% of all data objects in the Camry software had unlimited scope, meaning they could be accessed from almost anywhere. Many of these could, and arguably should, have been restricted to local or file-level scope.
So just generally poor data management practices. What about issues where different parts of the software might interfere with each other, running concurrently?
Concurrency bugs or race conditions. Yes, NASA did identify at least one specific potential race condition related to how the task scheduler was managed. More generally, the expert analysis found that shared global variables weren't always protected correctly. They weren't consistently declared volatile, which tells the compiler the variable might change unexpectedly, nor were accesses always protected by disabling interrupts. These are standard techniques to prevent bugs that can occur due to subtle timing differences when multiple tasks access the same data.
You mentioned recursion earlier as a potential issue flagged by static analysis. Why is recursion usually avoided in safety systems?
Recursion is when a function calls itself. It can be an elegant way to solve some problems, but it's generally forbidden in high-integrity systems for a couple of key reasons. First, it makes it very hard to predict how much stack memory the program will use. Each time the function calls itself, it uses more stack space. If it calls itself too many times, you get a stack overflow, which can crash the system or corrupt other memory.
And verifying it is harder.
Much harder. Analyzing recursive functions to prove they'll always terminate and won't overflow the stack is complex. So safety standards typically ban it or require extraordinary justification and analysis if it's used.
And Toyota's ETCS used recursion.
Yes, it did. And analysis suggested the system's stack was already about 94% full before any recursion even happened, leaving very little margin for error. Furthermore, the testimony indicated there wasn't proper mitigation for stack overflow. The system seemed to incorrectly assume a stack overflow would always cause a system reset, but analysis suggested it could potentially corrupt memory belonging to the real-time operating system, RTOS itself, leading to unpredictable behavior, not necessarily a clean reset.
That sounds dangerous. What about the watchdog timer? That's supposed to be a fundamental safety net, right? To detect if the software hangs or crashes.
It is. But the implementation of the watchdog timer in this system also drew criticism. Apparently, it was primarily designed to detect if the CPU load got too high.
Too high. What if a task died?
Exactly. If a critical task crashed or stopped running, the CPU load would likely decrease. So paradoxically, the watchdog might not detect the failure of a vital piece of software.
So it could fail silently.
Potentially. Testimony indicated the watchdog was basically just kicked periodically by a hardware timer. It wasn't monitoring the health or execution of individual critical tasks, including the main one, Task X, which handled throttle control and many failsafes. Adding to the concern, the system apparently ignored error codes reported by the RTOS itself, like codes indicating a task had died. So even if the operating system knew something was wrong, that information wasn't necessarily acted upon.
It feels like there's a pattern emerging. Not just specific bugs, but maybe a less than robust overall approach to safety.
That was certainly argued, pointing towards potential deficiencies in the safety culture. There was evidence suggesting maybe a lack of deep understanding or consistent application of standard software safety engineering practices.
Like what kind of evidence?
Things like testimony indicating a lack of familiarity with standard processes like formal code inspections. There was an internal Toyota email from 2007, cited in the proceedings, where an engineer suggested that building in robust fail-safe technology wasn't yet ingrained in the division's DNA.
Not in their DNA.
Yeah.
Quite a statement internally.
It is. And another employee, involved in investigating unintended acceleration reports, reportedly stated that because the system had fail-safes, software abnormalities couldn't be involved. That suggests a potential misunderstanding of how complex systems can fail and how fail-safes themselves can have flaws or limitations.
A sort of overconfidence in the fail-safes, perhaps.
Or perhaps an incomplete understanding of software failure modes. There were other architectural issues flagged too, like poor functional isolation. That critical task X handled both normal throttle control and many of the safety monitoring functions. Lumping unrelated critical functions together makes the code harder to analyze, test, and ensure that changes in one part don't break another. It's sometimes called the kitchen sink approach. Plus, they were using an uncertified version of the OSIC real-time operating system, running at a very high baseline CPU load, over 80%, leaving little headroom. Many functions were overly large. Code reviews seemed informal. There was a lack of rigorous configuration management and bug tracking cited. And crucially, a lack of formal, detailed software requirement specifications.
It's a long list of deviations from what you described as best practices.
It is quite a list based on the evidence presented in court and the NASA findings.
So given all that technical detail, how did the legal system, particularly the Bookout civil trial, process this? What was the threshold for finding Toyota responsible?
It's important to remember the legal standard in a civil trial like Bookout. It's not beyond a reasonable doubt like in a criminal case. It's the preponderance of the evidence, meaning more likely than not. Okay. So the jury had to decide. Was it more likely than not that Toyota failed to exercise reasonable care in designing the ETCS? Was the system as designed unreasonably dangerous? Was it more likely than not that a defect in the ETCS was a substantial factor in causing the crash? And was it economically and technically feasible for Toyota to have used a safer design?
More likely than not.
Yeah.
That's the key legal bar they had to clear.
Exactly.
Okay, so let's try to pull this all together as we wrap up. NASA didn't find that single, definitive, smoking gun electronic cause for all the reports.
Correct. No single cause was proven to explain every event. But when you look at the whole picture, the evidence from the investigations, the detailed expert analysis in the Bookout trial, the documented software issues, a different narrative emerges. It points to a confluence of factors: an ETCS architecture with potential single points of failure, software development practices that seem significantly lacking compared to industry norms, thousands of coding violations, extreme complexity, potential vulnerabilities to hardware faults that weren't fully mitigated, and questionable design choices in the fail-safe mechanisms themselves.
And possibly a safety culture that hadn't fully grasped the unique challenges of software in critical systems.
That was certainly argued. All these elements together created a system where plausibly unintended acceleration could occur due to an electronic or software issue. And critically, it could be very difficult for a driver to diagnose or overcome in a panic situation.
The technical details that came out, especially through the Bookout trial, are really illuminating. They offer insights that go way beyond just Toyota, don't they, into the whole challenge of software safety in cars today.
Absolutely. It raises fundamental questions about the level of rigor needed. How do we ensure safety in systems that rely on millions of lines of code, code written by humans, which inevitably contains bugs, code running on hardware that can experience random faults.
It really forces us to think about what constitutes reasonable care when designing and testing these incredibly complex, safety-critical systems in modern vehicles.
It does, and it leaves us with a critical question moving forward. What are the ongoing responsibilities, not just of the manufacturers, but also of the regulators, to keep pace? How do we ensure the safety of vehicles that are only becoming more software dependent with autonomous features and constant connectivity?
Finding that balance between pushing technology forward and the absolute imperative to protect human life, that's the ongoing challenge, isn't it?
It really is a constant critical balancing act.
Definitely food for thought. For anyone listening who wants to explore this further, there are some excellent resources. Professor Philip Koopman's blog has extensive writing on this. Junko Yoshida wrote some very insightful articles for E-Times covering the technical details for the trial. Michael Barr's team published presentations on the code analysis. And of course, the official NASA and NHTSA reports, plus materials for the book-out trial itself, are out there. We'll link to these in the description. This has been a fascinating, if sobering, deep dive. Thanks for walking us through the complexities.
Thank you. It's a critical topic with lessons that remain relevant today.
Indeed. Thank you all for joining us on the deep dive.